Good evening, everyone. And tonight we continue our series on prophecy in Tanakh, in the Hebrew Bible. And tonight, what I'd like to talk to you about, and we've kind of touched on this earlier, that I wanted to talk a little bit about prophecy in what they call early prophecy, which is really prophecy in biblical narrative. So the prophets that we see in kind of the stories of the kings and in Shmuel and Melachim and Samuel and Kings, those stories as opposed to the later book prophets. So in kind of academic parlance, what we call one early prophecy and the other classical prophecy. One of the reasons we make this distinction is a technical distinction. That what we call classical, like if I start saying, okay, who are some prophets? Most people are going to start with book prophets. Book prophets are prophets who wrote books, right? Yirmiyahu, Yeshayahu, Yechezkel, Amos. You're going to talk about people that have books named after them. You have books of their prophecies, right? I'm going to pause again. Can everyone hear me clearly? Does the sound clear? It's not fuzzy. There's nothing annoying going on. Okay, great. All right. So when we talk about those prophecies, so one of the questions frequently is, well, is this something that there's a speech here that goes on like forever? Did someone get up and say this speech and then they wrote it down? Or is this a literary work? Okay, so usually when we look at these books, we do kind of look at them as literary works because in the form that they have, that's so perfect and poetic, we say, well, probably this whole thing was not said, but there was a kernel that was said. And then when it was written down, it was kind of expanded on and the whole idea was kind of fleshed out. And there's a question because you do wonder, like you say, well, if Homer said, had all his books spoken orally, then you could have a very long speech go on. The argument that I've seen written saying, yes, but scribes couldn't take dictation that way in those days. So you couldn't expect a scribe to be sitting there writing as he spoke. We do know that Yirmiyahu had a scribe Baruch who he would dictate things to, and he would write them in a scroll, right? That he would later send or read, etc. So you absolutely do have kind of a written record of a prophet having a scribe who writes down what he tells him to write down. Okay. Then again, the question is, how long would that have been? But for many of when you're reading kind of the prophetic books, you can frequently put or sometimes I should say, not frequently, but certainly sometimes you can put your finger on the kernel. You could say, there's a thing where it says, Yirmiyahu said, and you have like these 2 or 3 psukim, these 2 or 3 verses that really summarize the whole thing. And you're like, yeah, totally. It says he stood up before Achel Hashem and he said, this is what's going on. And he's this really pithy saying, and you're like, aha, that's what he said to everyone. And then there's an expansion on it. Okay, and the question is, okay, so if we have those prophets and then we look at how they're described within narrative, and then you get to be honest, if you're talking about it from this is what's so frustrating for me when I'm dealing with Bible academically, because you can't just take a book as a book. If you're talking, I mentioned last class that I was repeating a class that I had given at Haifa. And I gave a class at Haifa University, and the preparation for it involved a tremendous amount of checking not just what other people said, but when they said different pieces of certain things were from. You have to be very careful because you could say, and especially the book of Shmuel, also the book of Kings of Melachim, is considered to be an edited work. And to a certain extent, it has to be an edited work because it starts way earlier than it ends, right? So one assumes that the person who's putting it together at the end wasn't there at the beginning or vice versa, right? So that means by definition, you've got an edited work, right? Someone's taking their sources and they're putting it together, right? So, Shmuel is like, so Shmuel is not around at the end of the book of Shmuel, right? All the kings have changed by the end of the book of Kings of Melachim, right? So you have to have, someone has to sat there and put it together. So by definition, you have an edited work, right? Someone's put it together. So, and then the question is, okay, so we have a story. Is this story really where it says it's from? So one of the stories, I think we're going to look at it tonight, we're going to relook. We looked at it once already, and we're going to revisit it briefly, where Achav is consistently called the king of Israel, and he's rarely named, right? And the question is, okay, why? Why is there this switch in mentioning Achav? You could be saying because it's so disgusted with Achav, it doesn't want to name him. Or is this a story that's much more from Yehuda, because Yehoshaphat is named, and Achav is not. He's just the king of Israel, because who cares, right? But let's talk about some kind of basic things that we see in terms of, and my challenge with tonight's class is that there's a lot of material, and obviously we're not going to go over all of it in one class. So I want to kind of give you an outline of what are prophets doing in these narratives. Now, one of the things we've already looked at are the mitnabim, the guys who are going into these ecstatic prophecies, right? So these guys who are going kind of into ecstasy. That's something that we, of course, we're only going to see it in narrative. And it's very interesting to note, as I've mentioned earlier, that these guys are, sometimes they're considered regular prophets, sometimes they're not. In general, this whole idea of going into an ecstatic trance is not really considered positive. There's generally a question, is this a good thing? Is this a bad thing? Does this make us doubt them, or does it not? In one of the stories we're going to look at tonight, it's very clear, and we've looked at it before. Again, I'll just revisit it. We're talking about a situation where it clearly makes them fakes and frauds, but not in every case. At the same time, this is something that is, it's interesting that there seems to be, during the time of Achav in particular, right, a lot of prophecy going on in the northern kingdom. There are a lot of just random prophets roaming around, okay? That's when you have B'nai Nevi'im, that's prophetic class of hundreds of people who need to be fed, right? And who are prophets, right? And they're in this kind of prophetic class. And that's where you have some kind of random prophets kind of coming in. And let me give you an example. Let me open up, let's take an example here. Let me find the right one that I want to look at. Okay, here, let's take a look. And this is an Achav story. I'm going to share my screen for a bit because I know you like to follow along. Here, there we go. Okay, so we are now in Melachim Aleph Chaf. It's 1 Kings 20. And towards the end of the chapter, it's the classic fight. It's against Aram. And we looked at this passage before, so I'm going to do it relatively quickly. And we have V'ish echad mibnei nevi'im. There's one person who's from this prophetic class, from this large group of kind of anonymous prophets. And he says to his friend, and he can follow it in English here, he says to his friend, beat me. And the man refuses. I always wonder, whenever I read this, I wonder if this is some kind of critique of the people who would beat themselves to get into an ecstatic trance. That's referred to much later, much later in Zechariah. Right. And I wonder if this is some kind of, because we're thinking that maybe that's what he wants, but that's actually not what he wants. And the other guy refuses to do it. He says, beat me up. He's like, no. And he says, well, since you didn't, you're going to go and get eaten by a lion. Right. And of course, that is in fact what happened. Not eaten by a lion, but killed by a lion. And of course, that is what happens. This is a classic thing. This is typical of of stuff from the north. When I say north, I mean the kingdom of Israel in the north, that there's this idea that God sends lions to kill people as a punishment. So that's something that happens to him. And so he finds another person, and this person is a smarter person. And in fact, he does beat him, and he really beats him up, and he causes wounds, right? upon this prophet's request. And then the prophet goes and he stands before the king and he puts on ashes on his eyes. And so he really looks like a guy who's been through hell. All right, that's the point. And the king passes and he cries out to the king, and so the prophet says, and I've said this before, but I think it bears repeating, a classic reason in both the kingdom of Yehuda and the kingdom of Israel, a reason to come to the king for a judgment is because you feel that what the regular judgment that you would get from a judge would not in fact be just. So you're coming to a king for real justice, right? And the king is supposed to say, yes, you're right. You know what? In this situation, I'm going to do something special. So the king could do something special. Or could say, no, you get, this is the regular judgment would be the correct one. All right. So this prophet's pretending to not be a prophet, and he's pretending to be just a regular guy. And he puts ashes on, and he's beaten up, and he says, I was in war, and someone brought me a captive, and he said, if you lose this guy, he says, you watch him. If you lose him, it says, either it's your life for his, or kikar kesef tishkol, you give me a nice big sum of silver, okay? And I was doing stuff around, and all of a sudden the guy's gone. Vayomer elav melech Yisrael, ken mishpatecha atah haratzta. And the king of Israel says, well, you did it, you get what's coming to you, right? You broke it, you buy it. You lost the guy, and now you have to take your punishment. Okay. And he takes off the ashes, and the king immediately recognizes that he's a prophet. How does he recognize he's a prophet? Does he recognize his face? It sounds like he does in fact recognize his face, because what he did was he covered himself with ashes, right? It doesn't say, and he saw that he was wearing the costume of prophets. He saw that he was wearing, I don't know, a sackcloth or a special, anything. It seems like he recognized him actually. Because what had happened, Achav had let go the king of Aram, right? He had let Ben-Hadad go. Okay, and so he said, so says God, because you released the person that I had meant to die, right? I kind of targeted for destruction. So your life is going to be for his life. And your people for his people. So the king went home really angry, and he went to Shomron. So what do we see here? We actually see a classic kind of setup that we see with another prophet. Who's the prophet who famously does this with the king? Does a fake court case so that the king realizes that he himself is guilty?
Natan.
Yeah?
Natan, isn't it?
Natan, who is David's prophet. He comes and he does the same thing, right? So let's take a quick look at that, because it's a classic, right? This is after David sins with Bathsheba. And it's interesting here, I want to point out, and this seems to be kind of the case with North versus South. I keep on saying North versus South, Yisrael versus Yehuda, right? Where in Yisrael, when we read about these prophets that kind of jump up, sometimes the king calls the prophet, usually the prophet's going to the king, okay? But the prophet, the good guy, right? In which you have to realize who's kind of compiling this history, but the good guy, the prophet that we're kind of voting for, even when he's saying, yay, king, like you're going to succeed, he's not the prophet that is with the king all the time. He's not the king's prophet, right? In Yehuda, the king has a prophet. in general, seems like, okay? It seems like David has both Gad and Natan. He has these prophets that are standard with him. Natan himself is a political force, right? Natan himself can actually manipulate events and say, oh, hey, Bathsheba, your son is going to be passed over because Adoniyahu's got this thing going on and he didn't invite any of us. And so Natan is actually politically involved as well. And but these guys are regulars in the court. The same way you have Shmuel with Shaul, right? That setup where you have Shaul's a secular king and he has Shmuel, his prophet, until Shmuel rejects him, right? You have this idea that David has his prophet who he has regular access to. Okay, we're going to talk about God in just a bit, and then go back to the northern prophets. Okay, whereas with the northern prophets, there's this idea that the king may send for them or they may go to the king, but they're all kind of going around. Some are random, some are named, but you don't have the same sort of institute, and you have this class of B'nai Nevi'im in the north, but you don't have this idea of the king has a prophet that he always goes to, right? And possibly this is because they don't seem to get along with their prophets that well, unless of course they're prophets of Baal, who, let's face it, are not writing this book. So we don't know if Achab had his Baal prophet, right, sitting next to him, giving him advice all the time. Okay, so let's take a look at David and Natan, and then we'll go back to some of our look at God, and then we'll go back to some of our northern prophets. So here we have Natan, and of course, what is the story? The story is that David has done something, I have to say, truly horrible, right? He has both had an affair with a married woman, the wife of one of his heroes, one of his like Giborim, one of his big war heroes, the daughter of another one of his war heroes, by the way, right? And the granddaughter of an advisor, but that's a side point. And he had an affair with her, and then in order to cover up the fact that he got her pregnant, tried to send her husband back home in order to cover up the pregnancy and make it look like the child is her husband. And when that doesn't work, he makes sure that her husband is killed in battle. Okay, so that whole thing is pretty bad. Exactly what the worst of it is. So you have a lot of, as an aside, you have a lot in the tradition where the actual sin is, it's important for the tradition to say that the actual sin is him killing Uriah. Especially it says later on that he was good in all ways except for the sin he did with Uriah HaChitti, right? So you have a basis for it in the Tanakh itself, that the major sin was getting Uriah, Bathsheba's husband, killed, whereas she was okay because all the men who went to battle had to write, a get for their wives before they went. That's not in Tanakh, right? That's a Chazal thing. And the reason it's kind of important to make it so that David did not actually sin with Bathsheba, despite the evidence in the text to the contrary, is because, of course, Shlomo HaMelech is born from his marriage to Bathsheba. If anyone knows the rules of what happens in halacha when someone has an affair, he is not allowed to marry the woman. Once that woman gets divorced from her husband, he still cannot marry her. If she's widowed or divorced, he still can't marry her because he had an affair with her as a married woman, right? And a child of an illicit union is a mamzer. So there's a reason halakhically that Chazal must explain how Shlomo HaMelech is okay. All right, that I'm just explaining to you because you see a lot of this, because if you don't know that, it can get very confusing when you see all the explanations why David didn't really sin with Bathsheba. You're like, well, why is this important when the text seems to say that he did? And the answer is that's the answer, because Shlomo HaMelech is not the baby born from the affair, right? Because that baby dies, right? The Shlomo HaMelech is the baby that is born after David marries Bathsheba, okay? And that would be problematic if there had been a true affair. Okay, so back to our topic. Here, okay, so here you see the story. So Natan goes to David. He's going, God has sent him, and he says to him, there are two men in the city. One is rich, one is poor. Lush here is poor, right? The rich person had lots of cattle. Remember, the poor man had one little sheep, and he loved this little sheep. And the rich man essentially stole this guy's little sheep that he loved like a daughter. Okay, and he says, "What should this and he and he killed it and fed it to a guest." It's just like awful, right? It's just like really just seems terrible. And so he says to David, what should happen to this guy? Remember, the thing is, he's bringing the reason this is supposed to be believable is because this is a case where something even worse has happened. If a judge just says, "Oh, well, he just stole a little sheep," that doesn't get to the total horribleness of what this rich person did, right? So he's coming to the king to see that justice is truly served, right? And so David got very angry at the man. He said, this guy should be killed, right? And he should pay fourfold for the sheep, which is a little weird because he's supposed to pay fourfold for the sheep anyway, right? But actually maybe sixfold. Now I don't remember. It could be they normally pay sixfold for the sheep, but whatever. David's like, you should die and pay fourfold for the sheep. Because he did this, and he didn't have pity, meaning he didn't have any sort of kind of feeling of what this meant for the other person, right? Vayomer Natan al David ata ha'ish, and Natan says to David, "You are the man," right? And this is the punchline. Natan is close to David, so you can just give him the punchline before saying the prophecy. He gives him the punchline. He says, "You hated that man. You thought that man was terrible because of what he did. He deserves death. You're the man." Okay. And then he says, and then of course he gets the prophecy that since he did this, which is et Uriah Hitti hikita b'cherev et ishto lekachta lecha leisha, right? You killed Uriah the Hittite by sword, and his wife you took as a woman. You had relations with her. V'oto haragta b'cherev b'nei Ammon, and him you killed through the sword of the Ammonites, and now a sword will never leave your home, right? Because you kivizitani, right? Because you despise me, God, by doing this, all right? By taking Eshet Uriah Hitti, the wife of Uriah Hitti, to you as a wife. Okay, I am going to raise evil to you from your home. This is on the one hand, it's midah keneged midah, it's measure for measure. In other words, he destroyed someone's home. I'm going to raise a punishment to you from your home. And also, it is the worst possible punishment for David HaMelech, because his true weakness, and you really see it through the book, his one place where he's not a king is in his family, right? The one place where he can't be harsh, where he makes big mistakes, right? Because they're his children and he loves them, right? It's in his home, and that's where the evil comes. And in fact, from this point, this is where you have the whole thing with Amnon raping Tamar, and Avshalom getting revenge on Amnon, and then Avshalom rebelling, right? You have that whole string of occurrences that happens from this point. Anyway, so what we see here, but then right away, when something you don't have with Achav, where Achav just gets angry and goes home. So what happens is Vayomer David al Natan chatati l'Hashem, right? David recognizes, he says, I sinned to God, right? And then Natan says, okay, you're not going to die, right? Remember that David said the guy should die, right? So Natan says, okay, you're not going to die, right? But the baby's going to die. The baby that Bathsheba is expecting from your relationship, right, is going to die. And in fact, the baby does, right? And David prays to God and it doesn't work. The baby dies and he comforts Bathsheba and then she has Shlomo. Okay. But then this is the beginning of the downfall of David's immediate family, right? His kingship continues with Shlomo, but his family and the first two heirs, right? And even in the third, it's supposed to be Amnon, after him is Avshalom, after him is Adoniyahu. And those three guys, they get, they're essentially, they end up being eliminated. Adoniyahu because it's supposed to be Shlomo, but Amnon and Avshalom, and of course Tamar, who was probably, who knows? It seemed like maybe she went crazy. It's bad stuff. Okay. Anyway, that's the situation with Natan. That's the situation with David. Of course, the whole idea is that David has a response. If we look at God, let me see if I can find. This isn't what I wanted to find. Give me just a moment, and I will find a God reference to you. And meanwhile, oh yes, so Moshe mentioned in terms of Moshe Matityahu, who is with us, it mentioned that the whole thing with Achav is very reminiscent of Shmuel's rebuke of Shaul for sparing Agag in violation of God's instructions. Now that actually brings me to a separate point, which is symbolic actions. Okay, so what we see with the classical prophets, with the book prophets, is symbolic actions frequently take a very important role in what they do. This is especially true for Yirmiyahu and Yechezkel. Jeremiah and Ezekiel, right? That they have these symbolic actions that are a very important part of the prophecy. And we're going to talk about what those mean when we get to those things. With these prophets, we don't see so many symbolic actions, except when it comes to kingship. So Shmuel rips. Right, rips. I think. Shaul's trying to hold Shmuel, and his robe rips, and Shmuel's like, "This is how the kingship's going to be ripped from you." And when let's actually take a quick look. Let me open it up. When Achiyah Hashiloni, okay, says to Yeravam, "You're going to be the king," he also rips a robe into 12 pieces. Let me find that for you in just a moment. Here we are. So this brings me to another point. So on the one hand, we have symbolic actions, and on the other, we have the role of prophet as kingmaker. Okay, this is something that we see a lot when we talk about these. I shouldn't say we see a lot. We see it. Okay, so Shmuel, of course, he actually goes and anoints Shaul as king. He actually goes and anoints David as king. So there's no bigger kingmaker than that. But also we have, of course, Achiyah choosing Yeravam. We have several prophets that are sent to anoint the next king. Okay, whether or not they end up being great, or sometimes they end up being terrible, but that they are chosen. So let's take a quick look. So here we have Achiyah Hashiloni, okay? And what happens is that, here we are, we have Yeravam, okay? And Yeravam has a very good position. Now, I'll remind you, we're not gonna read it inside, but Rechavam is Shlomo's son, right? Rechavam is the guy who's supposed to kind of carry on. And he has Yehuda on his side, but when he tries to get the other tribes on his side, they're like, "Will you cut our taxes?" And he's like, "No, I'm gonna raise your taxes." And they're like, "We don't think so." And Yeravam ends up being the king of the northern kingdom. The kingdom splits. Now, there's already kind of a split if you read the description of how Rechavam goes to kind of get everyone's buy-in. He goes to Yehuda, and then he makes a special trip to Shechem, which is the center of the other tribes, right? Which is Yosef, right? Yosef territory, right? And he's supposed to get because there already is this kind of split in allegiances, and he needs to win them over. and he does it, okay? And Yerovam becomes the king. So here you have, so it says Yerovam leaves Jerusalem. It's Shlomo is Va'ish Yerovam Gibor Chayil, right? Yerovam is a mighty man. Vayar Shlomo Tanar Ki Yoseh Melachahu V'Yafked Oto L'chos Sevel Bet Yosef. So Shlomo sees this young man. He sees he gets things done, and he appoints him to all of the labor of the house of Yosef, possibly also kind of as a bit of a tax collector, but he's in charge of the house of Yosef. Now, the house of Yosef, that's the other tribes, right? That's what's the center. That's what Shechem is the center of. So Yerovam already has access to the kind of like, they know him, right? He already has he's kind of in charge of them. Yerovam left Jerusalem. So Achia, the Shiloni, right, comes and finds him on the way, and he is covering himself up with a new garment, so he's not initially recognizable, and the two of them are alone in the field. Vayitpos Achia Basama Chadasha. Actually, no, it's not so much the recognizable, it's what he's going to do. It's Vayitpos Achia Basama Chadasha Shalav. He took his new garment, Vaykraeh Shnemasar Kraim. He ripped it into 12 pieces. Vayomer leYeravam Kasa Asara Kraim. And he says to Yerovam, take 10 of the pieces. Kicho Amar Hashem Elkei Yisrael, Hineni Korea et Hamamacha Miyad Shlomo, V'natati Lecha Tasara Shvatim. This is what the Lord God of Israel says. I'm going to be ripping the kingdom from Shlomo, and I'm going to give you 10 tribes. Okay. And I'm going to leave one for David, like one, but it says, but you've got 2 left. There's always a thing about how many tribes how are we counting them, etc. But at any rate, you're going to get 10. Okay, so he's gotten the seal of approval, and this is from Achia Hashiloni. We have, of course, other examples. So, for example, we have an anonymous one of Bnei Nevi'im goes to anoint Yehu ben Yehoshaphat on behalf of Elisha, right? You have the story we've already looked at several times where in terms of, let's look at it one more time. Here, let me share my screen again. Okay. So, and here we have, God giveth and God taketh away, right? Where you have Yerovam is offering at the altar, right? And a man of God, namely a prophet, comes and says, if you're going to behold, a son shall be born. Here, I'm going to read it from Hebrew. And a man of, so you have a prophet comes from Yehuda, and he comes to Bethel, and Yerovam is offering, because if you remember, he created essentially a temple at Bethel, and he says, Vayomer Mizbeach, he's speaking to the altar, right? Altar, Kol Amar Hashem. So says God, Hine ven nolad lebeit David Yoshiyahu shmo, v'zavach alecha et kornei bamot hamektivim alecha. There's going to be a son born to David, Yoshiyahu, and he is going to essentially kill the priests of these illicit worship places of worship, right? And he's going to burn their bones on it, right? And he said there's going to be, and now the altar itself is going to be ripped apart, and in fact it is, and that's a sign that this is going to end, right? It's it's a little bit less of a end of kingship, but it's kind of the end of this era of sacrificing outside of the temple. So we have these kind of, and then what happens, sorry for jumping around a little. So we have this idea that prophets come to kings, okay? They're kingmakers. I'm going to stop sharing again. They're kingmakers, and they also offer different prophecies regarding when wars are going to end or wars are going to begin, if they're going to win or if they're going to lose at battle. And this is in the north, they come and they tell them. Whereas with David, especially with David, he can just there's one point where God's like, get out of here, they're going to attack. The prophet God. He says to David, get out, they're going to attack you. And David does, right? And there's this idea that for David and for kings in Yehuda, you can have a prophet next to you advising you, right? Whereas in the north, you either have to call one to you or they have to come and seek you out to tell you what's going to happen, right? And that includes in a good case as well. And here, I'm going to stop here to read Susan's comment. The verse describing Yeravam's abilities and appointment to run things is reminiscent of the description of Yosef, the region Yeravam will rule. Yes, very nice point. Indeed. And the language there also. It's always fun to kind of see parallels also with language that I think I've mentioned this before, but very classically, Megillat Esther has parallel language, the Yosef story, and Megillat Esther is kind of represents almost a Binyamin, it's Ishimini, right? Mordechai is from Binyamin. And there's a real possibility that there was a group of people, particularly maybe even during Shivat Zion, who were thinking maybe there's going to be a king from Binyamin, because in Divrei Hayamim, in Chronicles, there's it includes a genealogy of 10 generations from Shaul. So someone's tracing who are the kids who are descended from Shaul, who maybe could be a king from Binyamin, right? But at any rate, and remember that Binyamin and Yosef are the same story. Binyamin is considered from Beit Yosef. That also we see in the David story. I always forget the guy who cursed him, but when he comes back and he curses him when he's running away, but when he comes back, he comes out and he says, "Here I'm the first to greet you, and I am the first to greet you from Beit Yosef." And he himself is from Binyamin. So we know that Binyamin and Beit Yosef are considered kind of part of the same thing, even though Binyamin switches back and forth between them and Yehuda in terms of which kingdom they belong to. Yes, Shimi Ben Gera, thank you. So Shimi Ben Gera, when he curses him, he curses David when David's running away. David comes back. He says, "Here, I am the first of Beit Yosef to greet you," right? But he himself is from Binyamin. So we know that this idea. So you could say Megillat Esther is kind of pro Binyamin, and also so it draws all these parallels to Yosef. Anyway, back to our prophets. So one of the differences in the north. So I'm going to show you a quick example of kind of the way it works in the north as opposed to the way it works in the south, the way it works in the northern kingdom, as opposed to the way with David, it's really the unified kingdom. So excuse me. But once it splits, you can see kind of the way things work. If we take a look here, this is in the same kind of story with all those wars against Aram, and he got that prophecy, that he should have let him go. But before that, so we have Vihine Navi Echad Nigash El Achav Melech Yisrael. One prophet goes to Achav, and he says, so says God, Hara'it et kol hamon hagadol hazeh, hineni notno bi'edcha hayom v'yadata ki ani Hashem. You see this great multitude, I'm going to give them into your hand. Okay, and then Achav is able to ask questions, and he says, by whom? And he says, by the young men of the princes or the leaders of these states, of these provinces. He's who's going to start? Who's going to begin the battle? He says, you rather. Right? And so once the prophet comes to him, he starts asking more questions, and that's what he does. That's how he acts, right? But it's a prophet who comes up to him, right? It's not a named prophet. We don't know who the guy is, and it's not important. And then here we have, and later on in the same chapter, I'm reading from Melachim Aleph Chaf, first again. Okay, 1 Kings 20. ויגש הנביא המלך ישראל ויאמר לו לך תתחזק ודע וראה את אשר תעשה כי לתשובת השנה מלך ארם עולה לך. So the same prophet, it sounds like it's the same prophet, but we still don't know who he is. He says, go strengthen yourself because in a year, the king of Aram is going to fight against you again. This is a prophet that doesn't have a particular role. He's not by the king all the time. It sounds like he came up to him and he said, listen, this is what's going to happen. And we know from like the Mari letters that this is not unusual that a prophet himself would approach and say, I have a prophecy for you. So it wouldn't be so weird for this to happen. At the same time, it's not like, for example, I believe this is, it's not the same thing as you have when with David, who has prophets. It may be the same, maybe a little bit the same as you have with Rechavam, the son of Shlomo, right? So remember that Yerovam there's a rebellion against Rechavam, right? The other tribes have rebelled against him because he wanted more taxes, and they're like, no way, and we can have our own kingdom. We don't need you, right? And he's ready to fight. Rechavam is ready to fight. So God speaks to Shmaya, right, who is a man of God, and he says, tell Rechavam and the rest of Yehuda and Binyamin, because they're already gathered to battle. He said, Ko amar Adonai lo ta'alu v'lo tilachamu im achechem b'nei Yisrael shuvu ish lebeito ki mi'iti nihiyah hadavar zeh v'yishma'u advar Adonai v'shuvu lelechet k'dvar Adonai. So says God, you shall not go up in battle against your brothers and sons of Israel. Everyone go home, because this is from me. This thing comes from God, and they listen to the word of God. It's interesting here that there's a prophecy. This is unusual for the narrative prophecies. In case you haven't noticed, most prophecies we've been looking at are said to whom? The king. It's a prophet's coming to the king, or the king is asking the prophet. It's to a king. Okay, they're choosing the king. It's to the king, or to the person who's going to be a king. This is addressed not just to the king. This is addressed to the people as well. And that's unusual. It's something that, by the way, again, is very common for the classical prophets. When we read the book prophets, these prophecies are very much to the people, right? They're absolutely not just to the king, practically ever. They're frequently to the king plus the people, and that's what this is, right? Why here? Possibly because you have all these people. This is a civil war. You've got to prevent a civil war. And the people have already gathered, right? It's already, Rechavam has already gathered all of Yehuda and Binyamin, 180,000 young men, right? That's a large amount, and they're all ready for war. So one assumes they're all revved up, they're ready to go to battle, and the prophecy can't just be to the king. The prophecy has to be to everyone. Also, if the idea is that you don't want a civil war, you can't have that antagonism staying there. It can't just be the king's decision. It has to be something that everyone understands. There isn't going to be a civil war. Okay, so what have we? And again, I know I'm jumping around a lot, but one of the things what are some of the things that we've seen? We've seen that they do fill a role as kingmakers. There are a lot of anonymous prophets, particularly in the north, who are coming along and saying things. They also, particularly it seems to be around the time of Achav. There are also some named prophets who kind of just pop up out of nowhere. There's in the Judean kingdom, particularly with David, he has a prophet kind of just by him and with constant access to him, whereas in the north, there are absolutely prophets around and they have access to the king. They seem to have differing access to the king, because there's one prophet that has to kind of disguise himself and do this whole court case scenario in order to be able to give a prophecy, and others seem to be able to just walk right up to him, or maybe ask to walk right up to him and give him a prophecy. They're mainly focused on outcomes for kings, outcomes of battles. However, there are some that are addressed to the people. I see we don't have time to go into it, that this is probably deserves its own class, talking about Eliyahu and Elisha. Eliyahu and Elisha are special because their activity, first of all, focuses a tremendous amount on miracles. There's a lot of miracle working for Eliyahu and Elisha. That's something that we don't see with the classical prophets. We don't see it that much among the early prophets either. Let's face it. There are certain miracles that say, oh, you don't believe me? Here, look, this thing happens, and then it happens. But the emphasis on miracle working for Eliyahu and Elisha are special. Eliyahu himself is a very special story, and what he does in Har Carmel, where he proves God, again through a miracle, right? He proves God as opposed to Baal, and there's this general recognition by the people, Hashem hu Elokim, right, which we use afterwards on Yamim Noraim, on the days of Ah, right? The Lord is God, right? That's something that we get from that story. It's not something we get from the story, but that line as this is belief, right? That we get that from the story of Eliyahu at Har Carmel, at Mount Carmel, when he proves, as it were, that God is the real God and not Baal, right? So that's absolutely to the people and not just to the king. And we have this statement that prevents civil war in the time of Rechavam and Yeravam, and that's to the people as well. And we have the role of prophets, in particularly the morality of kings in early prophecy, in prophecy and narrative. Okay, classical prophecy, everyone's morality, right? Amos is talking to the entire ruling class, the entire wealthy class. You guys are terrible, right? There's Yirmiyahu who talks to the prophets and the priest and the Kohanim, the priests, and the leaders and the kings, and he's like, you guys are wrong. What you're doing is wrong. Okay, and there are these statements. Excuse me, I think someone's like dog or something wrote a chat, but so let me get back to my train of thought. Excuse me. And so classical prophets, book prophets are frequently very involved in morality of the people. These prophets and narrative are frequently directing their prophecies to kings, not only and not always, but frequently and usually. And so they're involved in the morality of kings. We read Natan's statement to David about what he did in terms of morality. Now we take this for granted, that this is a statement to David and this is what you're going to fall over. But the fact is, what David did with Bathsheba and Uriah was not something that had to affect the kingdom. Morally horrible, but not something that was morally horrible to like Joe Schmo who's walking along and working in his field, right? It doesn't affect him, okay? But it's a horrible moral act. It shows a lack of morality of the king and a sinning by the king, and he's going to suffer because of it, right? And he's going to suffer as a person and as a king. Okay, and we have the same thing. Yeah, I figured it was a cat or a dog or something like that walked on the keyboard when I saw the chat. So it's something that David did, which is a horrible moral sin. It's the punishment affects him as a person and it affects him as a king. And we have something somewhat more drastic when it comes to the story of Kerem Navot, right? The vineyard of Navot, and let me pull that up. We have a few minutes, so I'm gonna quickly do that, and then we'll conclude. Okay, so here we have the story of the vineyard of Navot. This is in Melachim Aleph Chaf Aleph, the 1 Kings 21. And actually the story is that Achav wants this vineyard. Navot will not sell it to him. And Izebel actually kind of goes behind Achav's back. Izebel's like, I'll get it for you. And Achav, it's not really clear whether Achav knows just what Izebel is doing. Whether he knows and kind of turns a blind eye, whether he has no idea, Izebel essentially has Navot framed and killed. Okay, they said to Izebel, they're like, it's done, he's dead, and Izebel's like, great, Achav, take your vineyard, right? And so Achav hears he's dead, and he goes and he takes it. Now, again, you could also say, well, he didn't know what she did when she did it, but afterwards he could darn well figure it out. Izebel said, leave it to me, and now the guy's dead. You can figure out what probably happened, right? And so here it's Eliyahu, right? Vayivar Hashem el Eliyahu hatishbi, right? God speaks to Eliyahu hatishbi, and he says, go to Achav, and that he went down to the vineyard of Navot, right, to take it. And we have, of course, the famous line, Haratzachta v'gam yarashta, did you murder and also inherit? A useful line that still today, and he doesn't bother with a fake. He doesn't bother with a fake court case scenario. He says, you did this, you killed him, and you also inherited. Now, by the way, I think that this language kind of points to the idea that maybe Achav didn't know about the murder when it happened, but now he can darn well figure it out. And that's not stopping him from taking over this vineyard of this man who essentially his wife had murdered. Okay. So he goes and so he says, did you murder and also inherit? But the Balte of the morning, you say to him, saying, where the dogs licked the blood of Navot, they're going to lick your blood too. Okay. And what's cool, of course, is that Achav always says to Eliyahu, oh, did you find me my enemy? Right? Because he knows if Eliyahu is coming to him, it's not going to be anything good. Right? And what he says, essentially, Achav is not, it's not just going to be that Achav is going to be, Achav, his line will be cut off. Anyone who can, urinate on a wall, in other words, any boy in his line who could take on is going to be cut off. All right. And I'm going to I'm going to give over your house just like I did to Yeravam, the son of Nevat, and I did to Baasha ben Achia. By the way, Baasha also had a prophet who spoke to him. Right? That this anger that you have angered me and you have made Israel sin, right? And of course, Izebel is also going to get eaten by dogs, right? So terrible punishment. And the punishment here is, yes, he's made Israel sin, but the main thing seems to be the tremendous lack of morality. Now, I do want to point something else out. This is something that I've mentioned to when you think about let's take a step back here for a second. It interested me at one point to kind of compare what these when there are these generational punishments in Tanakh, right, in the Hebrew Bible, as opposed to generational punishments, and let's say in the famous Greek like plays and stuff like that, like in Sophocles, right? Like Oedipus Rex, right? So what causes one and what causes the other? So usually what causes them in these Greek plays are some really horrendous, disgusting, unbelievably amoral act. And because there was this amoral act, these totally innocent descendants of this person get horrible things happen to them. Whereas usually you see in Tanakh, particularly in the narratives of kings and leaders, is that there's an abuse of one's role. So for example, the sons of Eli, right? The sons of Eli who mess up the women who come to bring sacrifices, right? They are abusing their power. And because they're abusing their power, it is taken away from them. All right. You have a similar story with David. He abuses his power to the nth degree. And because he abuses his power, he's going to be attacked from within his own house. right? Here again, we have Achav. He's abusing his power. He and his wife makes sure, his wife uses her power to get this guy framed, right? Where they have no right to his land. Achav goes and takes the land. This abuse of power means you do not deserve to have power, right? That's usually the way it works in these in biblical narrative. Also remembering that unlike Greek oracles, which always have to come true, biblical prophecy does not always have to come true, right? You can repent and stop it, right? You can do other things to try and avoid it, right? It doesn't have that same kind of inevitability of Greek oracles. But of course, oracles in general in the ancient Near East worked differently as well, I have to say. But it's important to remember. So we kind of jumped around a little, but I'd like to summarize in terms of what we see, okay, what we see in these narrative prophecies in and of themselves, and also a little bit compared to kind of book prophecies. All right. So to summarize once again, okay, we see that these prophets are very active in kings' decisions. They're both king makers in some cases. They tell them go to war. They tell them don't go to war. You'll be defeated or you won't, right? They're involved in telling kings that their morality has crumbled and they are going to be punished, or that their actions against God. And I didn't read those prophecies so much, but of course there are plenty that say you are sacrificing in the Bamot, or you're sacrificing to foreign gods, and therefore you're going to lose your kingship, or you're going to lose this war. And so they mainly speak to kings about morality, about in very specific cases, but generally about war, about what's going to happen, who's going to be king, why they've messed up, right? They do sometimes use this kind of structure of, I'm bringing a court case to you so that you understand why this is happening, right? What's the point of bringing one of these fake court cases? Is that the king himself realizes, right? This is why you deserve this to happen. That thing that you said, forget it, the person should die, that's what you did, right? We noted that there's a difference between, let's say, particularly David, really, and his relationship to prophets who are kind of by his side, and in the nation and in the kingdom of Israel. And yet in the kingdom of Israel, there are a lot of prophets going around. They absolutely have access to prophecy, whether the prophet is coming to them or they're going to the prophet. We didn't reread the thing that we read, I believe it was in our last class. It was a couple classes ago where we had that there's that great story where Yehoshaphat and Achav are going to war together, and Yehoshaphat says, can't we ask a real prophet? Because all of the prophets are like, you go, you're gonna win. And Yehoshaphat's like, don't you have like someone reliable here? And they call this guy that we've never heard of before, and Achav's like, I don't want to talk to him. He only says bad things to me. And he even sends a messenger to say to the prophet, I'm summarizing it because we don't have a lot of time. He even sends a message to say to the prophet, listen, everyone else is saying the king's going to win. Maybe you should say the king's going to win. And the prophet's like, no, I'm only going to say what God tells me. And then he kind of mocks them when he gets there. He's like, oh yeah, sure, the king's going to win. And Achav, it's just called the king of Israel. He's like, say the truth. And he's like, you are going to lose. You're going to lose so badly. And he's like, he goes to Yehoshaphat and he's like, see, this guy only has bad things to say. And it's a great little vignette, but it also kind of shows this idea that there really are prophets in the north and reliable ones, okay? So you absolutely have a lot of prophets going around. You have some miraculous activity, but not as much as you would think of. It's mainly with Eliyahu and Elisha. That's also where you see kind of a prophetic succession. It's the one place where you really see one prophet saying to the other, you will be my successor. Now you will be the prophet. That's unusual. We don't usually see prophetic succession. And again, very rarely, although sometimes they do, very rarely are they turning to the people. They're mainly dealing with kings, okay? At the same time, we have the classical prophets, right? At the same time, later, whatever, but we have classical prophets, and those classical prophets are very concerned with the morality of the people, again, it's not that they're not, that the early prophets are not concerned, but they're mainly speaking with kings. The classical prophets are speaking to much larger groups frequently and to the king, right? And then what we're going to do is when we look at classical prophecies, we can say, okay, what's the piece here that we can see that it says, this he said right at the moment, and then this is the kind of expansion. If you like, I'm going to take a quick poll. If you like, we could do in the next class kind of more of a deep dive to Eliyahu and Elisha, because there's a lot there. Are people, yes? I see some,
Sure.
yes, okay. All right, so in our next class, we can do kind of more of a deep dive into Eliyahu and Elisha before we move on to book prophets, because they're so unusual and interesting. So we'll do that. So hold on. So thank you everyone for joining me. Are there any questions?